The wind in this part of Montana did not whisper. It came down from the mountains with a shriek, a solid thing that hit the valley floor and scoured it clean. It ripped the last dead leaves from the skeletal arms of the cottonwoods and drove the snow into drifts higher than a man's head. The sky was a low, bruised ceiling of gray, promising nothing but more cold, more wind, more endless, biting white. Through this frozen world, a horse stumbled. It was a gray mare, half dead on its feet, its ribs stark beneath a hide slick with frozen sweat. Each step was a plunge, a desperate heave from a drift that tried to claim it. On its back, Clara was no better off. She was cocooned in a man's heavy wool cloak, stolen in haste, but the wind found every gap. Beneath it, she was dying in a wedding dress. The fine white silk, meant for a church in a valley town, was now a frozen shroud, ripped at the hem and packed with snow. Her feet, shod only in thin slippers, had lost all feeling hours ago. Her hands, clenched on the reins, were white, unbending claws. She did not know where she was going. She only knew what she was fleeing. The image of the church burned behind her eyes, brighter than the snow blindness that threatened to take her. The scent of stale whiskey on her father's breath as he held her arm. His voice, thick with a pathetic plea. "Clara, girl, you must. He'll ruin me. He'll take the ranch." He meant Abel Mortensen, a name that owned the entire valley, a name synonymous with cattle, land, and a cold, grasping power. And Mortensen had a son, Thomas, a man twice her age with flat, damp eyes and a way of looking at her that made her skin crawl, as if he were assessing livestock. Her father, a man broken by drought and bad cards, had seen only salvation in the match. He was selling his only daughter to settle his debts. Clara had stood at the altar, the preacher's words washing over her, a drone that sounded like doom. She had looked at Thomas Mortensen, at the satisfied curl of his lip, and she had seen her entire life laid out, a cold bed, a silent house, and a quiet, daily death. She had not screamed, she had not cried. When the preacher asked if any man knew a reason why they should not be joined, she had simply turned and walked, not run. At first, just walked, down the aisle, past the shocked faces of the few guests. Her father had grabbed for her, but she'd pulled free. She was out the side door before the first shout, ripping the borrowed cloak from a peg and flinging herself onto the nearest horse. Now, the shouting was long gone, replaced by the howl of the wind. There was only the freezing and the failure of the horse. The mare's legs buckled. It gave a low, tearing groan and pitched sideways, sinking into the deep snow. Clara was thrown clear, a tangle of white silk and dark wool. She landed in a drift that swallowed her to the waist. "No," she whispered. The word was stolen by the wind. "No, get up, please, get up." She clawed at the mare, trying to pull its head up, but the animal only shuddered and went still. Its eyes were already glazing. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the numbness. She was alone, miles from any town, miles from any road. She tried to stand, to walk, but her legs were useless things, heavy and distant. The snow was a trap, a cold, soft bed inviting her to lie down. She took 2 steps, then fell. She pushed herself up, her frozen hands scraping on the crust. She took another. The world was tilting, the gray sky and the white land spinning into one. She saw a darkness ahead, a smudge against the white. Trees, a cabin, or just a shadow, a trick of the failing light. She crawled toward it. She did not remember falling the last time. She only remembered the sudden, terrible peace of letting go, the cold seeping into her bones not as pain, but as a final, quiet comfort. The snow began to cover her, a fine, white burial shroud. Eli Kane saw the smudge of color from his woodpile. He had lived in this cabin for 3 winters, far enough up the slope that townsfolk left him be. That was how he liked it. People were a complication he had no use for, a tangle of lies and greed and noise. He preferred the clean silence of the snow and the honest company of the pines. He was a solitary man, not a hermit. He went to town twice a year for salt, flour, and cartridges. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth. They remembered the fight, the brawl at the Mortensen ranch years ago that had left a man dead. They called him a killer, though no one had seen who threw the first punch or who wielded the branding iron that started the mess. Eli had just walked away, leaving the Mortensen foreman dead in the dirt, and built his life high on the mountain, carrying his scars, inside and out. He squinted against the stinging snow. It was not a deer. It was a pile of rags, and it was moving. He spat into the snow, a curse forming in his throat. He did not want this. Whatever this was, it was trouble. It was the world trying to climb his mountain. He walked toward it, his boots sinking deep. He carried his axe in one hand, his movements wary like a wolf circling a trap. He stopped. It was a woman. She was half buried, her face pale as the snow, lips a faint, bruised blue. A tangle of wet brown hair was frozen to her cheek. He saw the white silk of her dress peeking from under the cloak, and his gut tightened. He stood over her for a long moment, the wind tearing at his coat. Leave her. It was the smart thing to do. She was already half gone. It was the mountain's way. But she let out a breath, a tiny, ragged puff of vapor that was almost not there at all. Damnation, Eli whispered. He swung her up into his arms. She weighed nothing, a bundle of frozen rags and bones. He turned his back to the wind and carried her toward the cabin. He kicked the door open, and the wind pushed them both inside. He slammed it shut, the heavy bar falling into place, and the shriek of the storm was instantly muffled, reduced to a low moan and the creaking of the cabin walls. The single room was dim, lit only by the gray light from one small window and the dull orange glow from the stone hearth. It was not a warm place, but it was warmer than the world outside. The air smelled of wood smoke, old coffee, and the faint, metallic scent of his traps. A single cot, covered in patched blankets, was pushed against one wall. A rough-hewn table and one chair sat near the fire. His rifle leaned against the wall, always within reach. He did not put her on his bed. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the fire, his movements efficient, impersonal. He had to get the cold out of her, and fast. He pulled the frozen cloak away. It was stiff as a board. Then he saw the dress, silk and lace, frozen stiff, torn and filthy. His brow furrowed. What in God's name was a woman doing up here in a wedding gown? He saw her left hand, curled near her face. On her ring finger, a plain gold band. He froze. A wife. This was not trouble. This was a hanging offense. This was some man's property, and he had brought it into his cabin. His first instinct was to open the door and put her back outside. He stared at the ring, a small circle of gold that seemed to glow with danger. This was a woman who ran from what he could only guess, and he did not want to know. She moaned then, a thin, pitiful sound that broke the silence. It was the sound of a small animal, caught and dying. Eli's jaw tightened. He turned from her and grabbed a bucket, filling it with snow from the drift by the door. He knelt beside her and began the harsh work of saving her. He cut the thin slippers from her feet. They were white, waxen, the skin beneath mottled. He grabbed her hands, uncurling the frozen fingers. He rubbed them with snow, hard, the way he would treat a frostbitten calf. She cried out in her sleep, a sharp intake of breath as feeling, raw and painful, began to return. He paid it no mind. He worked with a grim focus, stripping the wet, frozen silk from her body. He did it without looking, his face turned toward the fire, handling her as he would a deer carcass. He found his longest wool shirt, one he used for work, and pulled it over her head. He wrapped her feet in clean rags and then rolled her, unceremonious, into his driest blankets. He set a pot of water and broth near the fire to heat. then dragged his chair to the far side of the hearth. He sat, picked up his rifle, and laid it across his lap. He watched her. He did not trust her. He did not trust the ring on her finger, and he did not trust the storm that had brought her. He sat and listened to the walls creak, and waited for the night to end. The night was long. Clara drifted in a gray, painful fog. She was warm, but the warmth was an agony. Her hands and feet were on fire, a deep, throbbing ache that felt as if needles were being driven into the bone. She woke in bursts, her mind snagged on terror. Once she saw the church. The air was cold, the flowers on the altar already wilting. Thomas Mortensen was turning toward her, his face impassive, his damp hand reaching for hers. "It is a contract," he was saying, his voice as flat as the plains. She whimpered, twisting in the blankets. "No, let me go." A shadow moved. A dark shape loomed over her. A rough hand pressed a tin cup to her lips. "Drink." The voice was low, like rocks grinding together. She drank. It was hot, salty broth. It burned a trail down her throat and settled in her stomach, a small, solid core of life. She fell back into the darkness. Later, she was running again, but her feet were stuck in mud, thick and pulling. Her father was shouting her name. "Clara, you'll ruin us! He'll take everything!" "Mercy," she whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. "Please, just mercy." Eli watched her from his chair. Her fear made the cabin feel small, suffocating. He knew that kind of fear. He had lived with it, the kind that settles in your gut and never leaves. Her cries for mercy scraped at something old and scarred inside him. He wanted her to be quiet. Her pain was too loud in the small room. He did not comfort her. He just sat, his rifle heavy on his knees. A ghost guarding a ghost. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the woman on his floor fought her way back to a life he was not sure he wanted to save. Morning came, not as sunlight, but as a lessening of the dark. The gray light at the window was opaque, thick with falling snow. The storm had not broken. It had settled in, a siege. Clara woke slowly. The first thing she felt was the ache in her limbs. The second was the scratch of wool against her skin. The third was the smell of coffee. She opened her eyes. She was on a rug, by a fire. The ceiling was low, made of rough logs. Across the small room, a man sat in a chair, watching her. He was big, dressed in worn canvas and flannel. He had a dark beard, streaked with gray, and eyes that were shadowed and still. A long scar, white and puckered, ran from his temple down his jaw. He held a rifle across his lap as if it were a natural part of him. Clara scrambled to sit up, clutching the blankets to her chest. She looked down. She was wearing a man's long shirt. Her dress was gone. Fear, sharp and immediate, choked her. "Where am I? What did you—" "Nothing you need to fear," he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. He did not move. "Not from me." He nodded toward the window. "You collapsed in the storm. I brought you in. You've been here the night." She remembered the fall, the mare, the endless suffocating cold. "I have to go," she said, her voice thin. "He'll be looking for me." She tried to push herself up. Her feet, wrapped in rags, hit the cold floorboards. She put weight on them, and a white-hot pain shot up her legs. She cried out and collapsed back onto the rug. Eli watched her, his expression unchanged. "Your feet are frozen bad. You're lucky you still have them. The dress," he gestured to a frozen, filthy bundle near the door, "is ruined. So are your shoes." "But I cannot stay here," she insisted, panic rising. "You do not understand. They will come for me." Eli took a slow sip of coffee from his tin cup. He looked at her, his gaze flat, missing nothing, not the fear in her eyes, not the gold band on her hand. "No one is coming for anyone," he said. He jerked his chin toward the window. Not in this. That storm set in. Could be a week. He stood up, and she flinched. He was taller than she'd thought, a solid wall of a man. He walked to the door and lifted the bar. He opened it a crack. The wind screamed into the room, flinging a spray of ice and snow that hissed in the fire. The world outside was a churning, blinding white. Clara could not see the woodpile, could not see anything but the storm. Eli put his shoulder to the door and forced it shut, the bar thudding back into place. He turned to look at her, a woman in his shirt, a refugee on his floor. "You won't last 10 steps out there," he said, and there was no kindness in it, only hard fact. "You are trapped, girl. Same as me." Clara stared at the door, the sound of the wind a living thing trying to get in. She looked at the man, his scarred face unreadable. She was a prisoner, not of the man, but of the snow. She and this dangerous stranger, bound together by the storm. The silence in the small cabin stretched, heavy and cold as the world outside. The first day bled into the second, and the second into a third. The storm did not break. It did not pause for breath. The wind kept howling, a high, mournful sound that scraped at the nerves. The snow piled up against the small window, sealing them in a dim, gray twilight. For Clara, the world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin. Her first few days were a blur of pain and sleep. The fire in her feet and hands subsided to a deep, agonizing ache, then to a pins and needles numbness that promised she might eventually heal. Eli Kane was a creature of shadow and silence. He moved about the cabin with a grim efficiency, demanding nothing of her. He slept on the floor near the door, rolled in his thickest coat, leaving her the cot. When her fever broke and she could finally sit up, she found a tin plate of jerky and hardtack waiting on the table. He gave her the cot, but he did not give her comfort. He was a wall. He tended the fire, checked his traps near the cabin, melted snow for water, and drank his coffee black and bitter. And he watched her. As her strength returned, her fear began to curdle into a restless, sharp-edged curiosity. She was trapped with a man who was, by all accounts, a killer. Yet he had not harmed her. He had saved her. He had fed her and given her his bed, all while keeping his distance, as if she were the one to be feared. She began to study him, the way one studies a chained wolf. His habits were rigid, the routine of a man who has only himself for company. Before dawn, he would be at the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life. He moved quietly, but there was a weight to him that seemed to sink into the floorboards. She watched him chop wood. He had a small stack by the door, but when the wind lulled for an hour, he went out. She watched through the grease-papered window. He did not just chop the wood. He attacked it. He swung the axe with a controlled, desperate fury, splitting the frozen pine logs in single, violent strokes. The effort sent steam rolling off his shoulders in the freezing air. He seemed to be working something out of himself, something deep and angry. Then there was the contradiction. Before they ate their meager meals, usually skillet bread and salted meat, he would stand by the table, hat in hand. He would bow his head for a moment, his lips moving in a silent, indiscernible whisper, a prayer. The gesture was so out of place with the hard, scarred man she saw that it startled her. A man who prayed to God but lived like the devil had forgotten him. And always, the gun. His revolver, a heavy Colt with a worn wooden grip, was never out of his reach. When he chopped wood, it was holstered on his hip. When he ate, it lay on the table beside his plate. When he sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, it rested on his knee. It was not a tool. She realized. It was a part of him. It was the physical proof of his past, a promise of his future. It was the wall he built around himself, more effective than logs and mud. The silence between them stretched for almost a week, broken only by necessary words. Water's hot, wood's low, more snow comin'. Finally, it was Clara who broke it. She was stronger now. She could walk, though her feet, wrapped in rags Eli had given her, still protested. She sat on the cot, mending the tears in his long wool shirt, the one she had been wearing, with a needle and thread from his small kit. "You knew the name," she said, her voice quiet, unused. Eli looked up from the trap he was oiling. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were guarded. "What name?" "Mortensen. When I said it, the first day, you knew it." He went back to his work, rubbing the oil into the steel mechanism. "Everyone in this valley knows that name. You worked for him, did not you?" He stopped. He set the trap down. His hands wiped slowly on his pants. "I did, a long time ago. North Range." "What happened?" she asked, her voice softer still. He looked at her, and for a second, she saw something flash in his eyes, not anger, but a deep, settled weariness. "You ask a lot of questions. Girl." "I have nothing else to do," she whispered, her hands stilling on the wool. Eli sighed, a rough sound. He picked up his coffee cup and stared into it, as if reading his past in the black liquid. "There was a brawl," he said, his voice flat. "At the ranch, Abel Mortensen's brother, Silas. He was a mean man, mean with his liquor and mean with his hands. We had words. It got loud, it got violent." He paused, his thumb tracing the scar on his jaw. "He came at me. He had a running iron, hot from the fire, meant to mark me. I grabbed a rail from the fence." He looked down at his own hands, large and calloused. When it was over, he was on the ground. He did not get up. Clara's breath caught. "You killed him." "That's what they called it," Eli said, his voice hardening. "Murder. Abel Mortensen owned the sheriff, owned the judge. No one much cared that Silas started it. No one much cared that it was his life or mine. All they saw was a hired hand killing a Mortensen. They would have swung me from the nearest tree." "So you ran?" "I rode," he corrected. "I rode up here, where the law don't bother to climb. Been here ever since." He looked around the small, dim cabin, his gaze lingering on the rifle in the corner. "Been a ghost." The confession hung in the air, thick as the wood smoke. He had given her his story, a heavy, dangerous thing. She knew she owed him hers. She set the shirt aside. Her fingers found the gold band on her left hand. She had not been able to get it off her swollen finger. "I am ashamed," she said, looking at the ring. Eli watched her, his expression unreadable. "My father," she began, her voice trembling. He has debts. He drinks. He gambles. He lost our land, bit by bit, to Abel Mortensen. We had nothing left, just me." She looked up, meeting his hard gaze. "Mortensen has a son, Thomas. He wanted me, a bride, to seal the bargain. My father agreed. He said it was the only way to save what was left. He called it a marriage. It felt like a burial." She recounted the wedding, the cold church, the look in Thomas's eyes, her escape. "I did not even finish the vows," she finished, her voice thick with self-loathing. "I just ran. I left my father to face him. I stole a horse. I ran like a coward." She expected him to grunt, to turn away. He had killed a man in self-defense. She had just run from a promise. Eli was silent for a long time. He rose from his chair and walked to the hearth, poking the fire. The logs crackled, spitting embers. "You feel shame," he said, his back to her. "You feel like a coward." He turned. He looked at her, sitting on his cot, wearing his clothes, her feet bundled in rags. He looked at her tear-streaked face. "You were property," he said, his voice rough. "Same as a horse, same as a parcel of land. You were being sold to settle a man's debt. You ran, you rode into a blizzard in a silk dress and shoes made for dancing. You lost your horse. You near froze to death, but you did not stop." He took a step closer, You're still here. That ain't cowardice. Clara, that's just survival. And it's the hardest thing there is. It was the first time he had used her name. It landed between them. A fragile, trembling thing. The storm stretched into a second week, then a third. The world outside remained a wall of white, but inside the cabin, the ice had begun to crack. They spoke more. He taught her how to set a snare, how to read the weather and the color of the sky. She cooked, making the salt pork and beans taste different, better. She mended his clothes, her small, neat stitches a contrast to his own clumsy repairs. The cabin was too small. They were always near. A tension, subtle and unspoken, began to build. It was a physical thing, an awareness that filled the small space. When she handed him his plate, their fingers brushed. It felt like a static shock. When he passed behind her to get to the woodpile, his arm grazed her back. She froze, her breath catching. He smelled of pine smoke, old leather, and coffee. She smelled of the lye soap he used and, faintly, of the woman she used to be. They worked together. A leak formed in the roof from the sheer weight of the snow. They spent an afternoon trying to fix it from the inside. Eli on the table, pushing at the sod ceiling. Clara below, handing him rags and a small wedge of wood. "Higher!" he grunted, reaching down, his face tight with effort. "To the left." She stretched up, her hand meeting his. His skin was rough, calloused, but his grip, as he took the wedge, was careful. They were close, closer than they had ever been. She could see the pulse beating in his throat, see the flecks of gray in his beard. He looked down at her, his dark eyes unreadable. He held her gaze for a beat too long. He pulled back, his work suddenly rougher. That's it. That night, the world changed. The wind stopped. The silence was so sudden, so absolute, that it woke them both. There was no howl, no rattle at the window, just a deep, profound stillness. And then, a sound, a low, distant rumble. Eli was off the floor in an instant, grabbing his rifle. "What is it?" Clara whispered, sitting up on the cot. "Is it them?" "No," he said, moving to the door, listening. Another rumble, closer. It shook the tin cup on the table, and then a sharp crack, like a rifle shot, but bigger. Thunder. Eli pulled the bar from the door and opened it an inch. A blast of air hit them, but it was not cold. It was warm, wet, rain. A flash of brilliant white light lit the cabin, illuminating Eli's face, casting his scar in sharp relief. He looked stunned. "A spring thunder," he said, his voice full of disbelief. "The thaw." The storm that had buried them was not a winter blizzard. It was the last, violent gasp of the season, and it was being broken by a warm Chinook wind. The change in the air was immediate. The cabin, which had been a freezing sanctuary, suddenly felt hot, close, suffocating. The sound of dripping started, first from the eaves, then from the leak they had failed to fix. Drip, drip, drip. Eli seemed agitated. He paced the small room, a wolf in a cage that was suddenly too small. The breaking of the storm meant the world was coming back. It meant she could leave. It meant men could ride. "God's finally done trying to bury us," he said, his voice bitter. He stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the melting snow. Clara, wrapped in a blanket, rose from the cot. She felt a strange new strength, a defiance born of weeks of survival. "Maybe he was protecting us," she said. Eli laughed, a harsh, dry sound. "Protecting? God don't protect, girl. He just watches. He watches men like Mortensen win and men like me hang. He watches men like your father sell their daughters." "And women like me get sold," Clara added, her voice quiet but hard as iron. She walked toward the fire. "Is that what you believe? That we are just lost?" "We're animals," Eli said, turning from the window. His eyes were dark, haunted. We get what we take, or we get punished for what we've done. And this, she challenged, gesturing to the cabin, to his isolation. This is your punishment, living up here alone, waiting to die. Is that what you earned? It is, he said, his voice low. By living? She pressed, stepping closer. By defending yourself? I killed a man, Clara. The way he said her name was rough, like an admission of guilt. That ain't something you wash off. It stains. You should stay away from me. I ain't safe. Safe? She was close now, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him. The air crackled, just like the sky outside. She was trembling, but not from cold. It was fury. It was a desperate, aching need to break through the wall he had built. You think I'm afraid of you? She asked. He looked down at her, his face a mask of old pain. You should be. I ain't the man you think I am. I ain't decent. She saw the raw desire in his eyes, warring with a guilt so profound it made him shake. He was punishing himself, had been for years, and she, who had been punished by everyone else, could not stand it. She reached up, her hand trembling, and touched the scar on his jaw. He flinched, but did not pull away. Darlin, she whispered, her voice husky, almost breaking. I don't bite. He stared at her, poleaxed, his breath hitched in his chest. Unless you ask. The words hung in the suffocating, wet air. It was a challenge, a plea, a confession. He looked at her mouth, at the defiant bravery in her eyes. He wanted God in heaven, how he wanted, to pull her close, to forget the blood on his hands, to be the man she thought he was, just for a moment. But the guilt was stronger. The stain was too deep. He was a killer. He was poison. He recoiled, physically stumbling back a step, his hand grabbing the edge of the table for support. His revolver rattled. No, he choked out, the word torn from him. I'm not that man. I can't be. He turned his back on her, his broad shoulders heaving. He braced his hands against the cabin wall, his head bowed, as if fighting off a physical blow. Outside, the thunder rolled away into the mountains. The rain softened, turning into a steady, rhythmic drumming on the roof. The drip inside the cabin sped up, a constant, hollow tap. The great storm that had trapped them was over, but in the small, hot cabin, a different storm, one of unspoken yearning and terrible guilt, had just begun. The silence that fell between them was heavier and more dangerous than the wind had ever been. The thaw came not as a gentle promise, but as a violent cracking. For 3 days, the cabin was filled with the sound of the world tearing itself apart. The snowpack, meters deep on the mountain, groaned and shifted. Water began to drip, then run, then pour. The creek below the cabin, which had been a ribbon of ice, turned into a muddy, raging roar. Inside the small room, the air was thick, wet, and heavy. The weeks of shared confinement, of unspoken tension and that one night of charged silence, had worn thin. Eli Kane was a man possessed by a restless, caged energy. He had retreated completely after Clara's whispered words, turning back into the hard, scarred stranger she had first met. He was gruff, his words clipped, his eyes avoiding hers. He spent his time oiling his rifle, pacing the small floor or standing at the door, staring into the gray, melting world as if it were an enemy. The thaw, for him, was a release. It was an escape. On the 4th morning, the rain stopped. A weak, watery sun broke through the clouds. The world was a ruin of mud, broken branches, and dirty, receding snow. Eli turned from the door, his face set. It's time, he said. Clara, who was packing the last of their dried meat into a sack, looked up. Time. The pass will be a swamp, but the trail down to town is open. I'll take you as far as the ridge. From there, you can follow the creek. It'll lead you straight to town. The blood drained from her face. Town. The word hit her like a slap. No! There's a stage. He continued, ignoring her, his voice hard as he focused on logistics. It runs twice a week. You can get a ticket east. Disappear. I said no, she repeated, her voice rising. Eli, I cannot go to town. That is the first place they will look. That is the first place he will look. Who? Thomas Mortensen, the man I was supposed to marry. His father owns that town. He owns the sheriff. He owns the stage line. Walking in there is walking into a trap. Eli slammed his fist against the doorframe. A sudden, violent motion that made her flinch. Then what? He demanded, his voice a low growl. You cannot stay here. This ain't a life. It ain't safe. You think they won't look up here? I think you want me gone, she whispered, the truth of it landing hard between them. He turned to face her, and his eyes, for a moment, were stripped bare. She saw the war inside him, the shame, the want, the desperate need for the isolation he had cultivated. He was not just protecting her. He was protecting himself from her. Yes, he admitted, the word rough. I want you gone. You bringing the world in here, and I want no part of it. She flinched, but held her ground. I have nowhere to go. He scrubbed a hand over his face, through his beard, his frustration palpable. He looked at her, this woman who had survived a blizzard, who had challenged him, who had offered a strange, terrifying tenderness. He could not send her to town. He knew what Mortensen's men were, but he could not keep her. He let out a long breath. There is another way. South, over the far ridge. It's a hard ride. Maybe 3-4 days. There's a mining settlement. Hard luck. It ain't much. Just a camp full of men digging for silver. Run by no one. A mining camp? The thought of a town full of rough men was almost as frightening as Mortensen. They don't ask names, Eli said. They don't care about a woman's past. Long as she can cook or clean, you could find work, earn enough to get a wagon ticket west, clean away, California. Maybe you could disappear. He paused. It's a hard trail, but I'll guide you. I'll take you to the edge of the settlement. She looked at him. He was offering her a path. It was a dangerous one, but it was a way. It was not a return to her father, or to Thomas. It was, for the first time, a step forward. I will go, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I will not be a burden on you any longer. His face tightened, as if her words had struck him. Get your things, he said, turning away. We leave now. The journey was a misery. The world was a vast, sucking bog of mud. The trail Eli had spoken of was little more than a game track, hidden beneath patches of slushy, rotten snow and thick red clay that pulled at the horses' hooves. They rode his 2 mules, hardy animals that were better suited to the terrain than any horse. They rode in silence. The awkwardness of the cabin had followed them, amplified by the vast, empty sky. Eli rode ahead, his rifle across his saddle, his back a rigid wall. Clara followed, her small bundle tied behind her. She had nothing of her own, only the patched wool shirt, a pair of canvas pants he had found for her, and his old, oversized coat. The wedding ring was still on her finger, a hateful golden shackle she could not remove. That evening, they made camp near a riverbank. The water was high and fast, brown with runoff, but cleaner than the standing pools on the trail. The air was cold, but the biting edge of the deep winter was gone, while Eli set snares for rabbits. Clara knelt by the water's edge, her hair, matted and greasy from weeks in the smoky cabin, felt heavy and foul. She unbound it, letting it fall. It was the only part of her that felt like the woman she had been. Using the small piece of lye soap from Eli's pack, she leaned over and plunged her head into the icy water. The shock of it took her breath away, but it was a clean pain. She scrubbed, her fingers working at her scalp, washing away the smoke, the fear, the smell of the cabin. When she rose, Her hair was dark, streaming, and her skin was numb. Eli had returned. He stood by the mules, his back to her, unstraking a blanket. He had stopped mid-motion. He did not want to look. He had spent the day trying not to see her, trying to build the wall back up. He told himself she was a package to be delivered, a problem to be solved. But he saw her. He saw her in profile, kneeling by the river, her face pale and serious. She wrung the water from her hair, the long, dark strands clinging to her neck and the wool of his shirt. In the gray twilight, she looked less like a runaway bride and more like a wood nymph, something wild and elemental that did not belong to the world of men, and certainly not to him. A deep, aching want rose in his chest, so sharp it felt like shame. He felt like a brute, no better than Thomas Mortensen, staring at a woman who was not his to see. He hated himself for it. He turned away, his movements jerky, and began sharpening his knife with a vicious, scraping sound. That night, they sat by a small, crackling fire. The silence was too heavy. Eli had snared 2 small rabbits, and they roasted them on green sticks, the smell of the meat rich in the damp air. Clara spoke first, her voice soft, directed at the flames. "I do not think I ever had a home." Eli looked up, his expression guarded. "Even before," she clarified. "Before my father changed. Our house was always cold. My mother was sick for a long time. When she died, the house just emptied out. My father filled it with his debts, with his anger. When he told me I had to marry Thomas, he said it was to save our home, but it was already gone." She looked at him, her eyes clear and sad in the firelight. "I was running from a graveyard." Eli watched her, the hard line of his jaw softening. He understood that. The emptiness. He took a bite of the rabbit, chewed slowly. "My mother died on the trail," he said, his voice low. It was something he had not said aloud in years. Clara waited, silent. "We came from Ohio. My father thought, he thought he'd find something better out here. We joined a wagon train. It was 1858. He stared into the fire, seeing not the flames, but a line of wagons in the dust. "She got the cholera, near the Platte. It was fast." "Oh, Eli," Clara whispered. "It was so fast," he repeated, his voice hollow. "She was fine at breakfast, gone by supper. They wouldn't stop the train, afraid of it spreading. My father and we buried her in a thin blanket, right by the trail, put up a wooden cross. I saw a man from the next wagon pull it up for firewood the next morning." He looked at his hands. "I was 15. I learned that day. The world just keeps moving. It don't stop for your grief. It just plows it under. My father died 2 years later in a mining accident. I've been on my own since." They sat in silence. But it was a different kind. It was a shared quiet, the space between them filled with the ghosts they both carried. He had lost his past, and she had been sold for hers. The night deepened. The fire burned low, casting flickering shadows on the pines that ringed the small clearing. Eli was adding a log to the coals when he froze. He did not make a sound. He simply stopped, his head cocked, listening. Clara went still. "What is it?" "Shh." He rose in one silent, fluid motion, grabbing his rifle. He scanned the darkness beyond the firelight. Then she heard it, a faint click, a snap of a dry twig. "Get behind me," Eli whispered, pushing her back toward the mules. "Stay quiet." A pair of yellow eyes glowed in the dark, then another pair, and another. Wolves. They were lean, hungry, spring-starved. The pack was large, maybe 6 or 7. Emboldened by the thaw, they were circling, just beyond the ring of light. A low, menacing growl rumbled through the clearing. Eli raised his rifle, but he did not shoot. "They're just curious," he muttered. "Testing." "Eli," Clara's voice trembled. One of the wolves, larger than the rest, crept forward, its belly low to the ground. "Get back," Eli yelled. He grabbed a burning branch from the fire and hurled it into the darkness. It landed with a hiss, and the eyes scattered back. But they did not leave. "Damn it," Eli growled. He knew they had to be driven off, or they would be at them all night. He walked to the edge of the light, his rifle ready. "Go on, get—" Another wolf, seeing his attention divided, lunged from the shadows on his left flank. It happened in a second. Clara screamed. Eli spun, bringing the rifle butt around, but the wolf was too fast. It snapped, its teeth tearing at his forearm. Eli roared, a sound of pure rage, and kicked the animal hard in the ribs. It yelped and fell back. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot exploded through the night, echoing off the river canyon. The wolf fell, and the other shadows vanished into the trees. Silence, absolute and ringing, fell on the camp. The only sound was the rush of the river and Eli's harsh, ragged breathing. "It is gone," Clara said, her voice shaking. "They're gone," he corrected, his voice strained. He stood in the shadows, his back to her. "Eli, you are hurt." She moved toward him. "It's nothing, a scratch." He was trying to inspect his arm in the dark. "Let me see." She was at his side, grabbing his hand. "Come to the fire." "Clara, I said it's fine." She ignored him, pulling him stubbornly toward the light. "Sit." He sat heavily on a log, his face pale beneath his beard. When she saw the arm, she gasped. His sleeve was shredded, and blood, dark and sluggish, welled from a series of deep puncture wounds. It was not a scratch. "Oh, God," she whispered. Her panic rose, but she forced it down. She had seen her father through worse. "It needs cleaning," she said, her voice taking on a practical edge. She grabbed her pack and ripped a long strip from the hem of the wool shirt she'd been given. "Do you have whiskey?" He nodded toward his saddlebag. She fetched his tin flask, uncorked it, and knelt before him. "This will hurt," she said. "Just do it." She took his arm, her small hand surprisingly steady. His forearm was thick with muscle, covered in dark hair now matted with blood. She poured the whiskey directly into the wounds. Eli hissed, his whole body tensing, a low groan torn from his throat, but he did not pull away. She began to clean the wound, her touch gentle but firm, daubing at the blood with the cloth. She was close, her hair, still damp, brushing his chest. He could smell the soap on her skin, mixed with the sharp, metallic tang of his own blood. Her hands were trembling. She was trying to be strong, but he could see the fear in her eyes, not of the blood, but for him. "You're shaken," he murmured, his voice rough with pain. "I am fine," she said, her fingers working to tie the bandage tight. "Hold still." She finished the knot, her hands lingering on his arm. They were both breathing hard. The night was cold, but a fierce heat radiated from where they touched. He looked down at her bent head, at the white parting in her dark hair. She had been so brave. She looked up. Their faces were inches apart. The firelight flickered in her eyes, turning them a deep, liquid brown. He saw the last of her fear fade, replaced by something else, something raw and unnamed that mirrored the ache in his own chest. He should pull away. He was stained. He was a killer. He was the man who had turned her down in the cabin. But he was also the man who had just bled for her, and she was the woman who was tending his wound, her hands gentle on his skin. His good hand, the one not wrapped in bloody rags, came up. He meant to push her away. He meant to thank her. He meant to do anything but what he did. His fingers, rough and calloused, brushed her cheek. She did not flinch. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. He leaned in. The kiss was not a thunderclap. It was a slow, uncertain collision. It was slow, hesitant, tasting of whiskey and blood and wood smoke. His lips were chapped, his beard rough against her skin. It was not the kiss of a lover. It was the desperate, fumbling kiss of two people who had been alone for so long they had forgotten how to touch. It was clumsy and afraid, and full of a terrible, aching need. She pressed into him, her small hands gripping his shirt. He let his wounded arm rest on her shoulder, his good hand tangling in her damp hair, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was tilting. Then, as suddenly as it began, it broke. He pulled back, his eyes wide, as if surfacing from deep water. The shame returned, sharp and immediate. He looked at her mouth, and he felt a wave of self-loathing. Clara stared at him, her lips parted, her face stunned. He stood up abruptly, turning his back to her. "The fire," he muttered. "Need to build up the fire." He began to pile logs on the flames, his movements jerky, angry. Clara sat by the river, her body trembling. She touched her lips. She did not know what to feel, terror or shame, or a strange, wild joy. Morning came, cold and gray. The regret was a tangible thing, a third person in their camp. Eli was packed before she was fully awake. He avoided her eyes, his face a mask of stone. He spoke only to give orders. "Douse the fire. Strap that bundle tight." He moved with a stiff, pained gait, his arm clearly bothering him. But his silence was louder than any cry of pain. He was distancing himself again, building the wall higher than it had ever been. He was angry at himself for the kiss, for the moment of weakness, for letting her see the man beneath the scars. Clara watched him, her heart a heavy, cold knot in her chest. She understood. He was running again, not from the law, but from her. She said nothing, just mounted her mule, her whole body aching with a quiet, hopeless sorrow. They rode for 2 days, the silence stretching between them, thin and brittle. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, they came to a clearing. In the center stood the ruins of a building. It had been a way station, a small trading post on a route that had long since been abandoned. Half of it was burned. The roof caved in, the windows dark, empty sockets. The place was haunted, a monument to failure. "We'll rest the mules," Eli said, his voice flat. He dismounted and began checking the animal's hooves, his bad arm held stiffly at his side. Clara slid from the saddle, her legs numb. She walked into the ruin, seeking shelter from the wind. The one remaining room was filled with debris, rotted sacks, a broken chair, the stench of mold. Something was tacked to the one piece of wall still standing. It was a piece of paper, soaked and peeling, but the words were still visible, printed in thick, black ink. "Wanted." She stepped closer. Her eyes scanned the text. "For the murder of Silas Mortensen." Beneath it, a name, Eli Kane, and a reward. She had heard his story. But this was different. This was the law. This was a piece of paper that made him a criminal, a fugitive, a man to be hunted. This was what he had been running from. She pulled the damp paper from the wall, her hands shaking. She turned and walked back outside. Eli was tightening a cinch on his saddle. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowing at the paper in her hand. He knew, instantly, what it was. His whole body went rigid. He looked like a cornered animal, ready to fight or flee. Clara stopped a few feet from him, holding out the poster. It fluttered in the wind. "Murder," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It says murder?" Eli stared at the paper, then at her. He waited for the accusation, the fear, the revulsion. He had seen it in the eyes of everyone else. "He told you it was murder," he said, his voice dead. "Abel Mortensen." "You told me it was a brawl," she countered, her voice trembling. This is a warrant." He finally let go of the saddle, his shoulders slumping. He looked tired, not just tired from the ride, but a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that came from years of looking over his shoulder. "It was a brawl," he said, his voice low, raw. "Until he came at me with the iron. Silas. He was drunk. He said he was tired of me looking at him. Said he'd teach me my place. He had 2 of his men hold me." Eli's hand unconsciously went to his side, his fingers tracing a spot on his ribs. "They held me," he repeated, his voice thick with the memory, the humiliation. He had the running iron, hot, glowing. He was laughing. He said he was going to put the Mortensen M on me, brand me, like cattle. Clara finished, her voice choked. "Like property." Eli met her gaze. The pain and rage in his eyes were so profound she almost stepped back. "I broke free. I grabbed the fence rail. I hit him. I hit him until he stopped moving. Until they all stopped moving." He took a ragged breath. "I did not mean to kill him. I would not let him do it. I would not let him make me that." He looked at her, his face stripped bare, expecting her to run, to scream, to finally see him as the monster the world claimed he was. Clara looked at the wanted poster in her hand, at the word murder. Then she looked at his face, at the scar, at the pain in his eyes. She saw the man who had pulled her from the snow, the man who had prayed over his food, the man who had been bitten by a wolf to protect her, the man who had kissed her with a desperate, breaking loneliness. She saw the man who had been marked as property, just as she had. She did not run, she stepped forward. Slowly, she crumpled the wanted poster in her fist. She reached out and laid her hand on his wounded arm, her touch light, her fingers resting over the bandage she had tied. He flinched, but did not pull away. "You already paid," she said, her voice soft, but fierce as the wind. "You already paid more than they will ever know." Clara's words, spoken with such quiet, defiant faith, hung in the air between them. Eli had no answer. He had been seen as a brute, a killer, a fugitive, for so long that her acceptance was a weapon he had no defense against. He looked at her hand on his arm, this small, pale woman who had faced down a blizzard and now faced down his past, and he felt a crack run through the cold wall he had built around his heart. He pulled away, his voice rough. "We ride." He did not know what her words meant. He did not know what that kiss by the river meant. He only knew that the woman crumpled in his fist was a wanted poster, and the world was full of men who would collect on it. He had to get her to hard luck. He had to get her away from him. They rode south, the air holding the damp chill of a false spring. The thaw had made the lowlands a treacherous swamp, but Eli kept them to the high ground, following game trails that were little more than memories in the rock. They spoke little, the intimacy of the previous night a gulf between them. 2 days later, they saw the smoke. It was not the thin plume of a hunter's fire, but the dirty, smudging smoke of a large camp. It was directly in their path, spread across the valley that led to the mining settlement. Eli reined in his mule, his hand instantly on the rifle in his scabbard. He squinted, his eyes tracing the valley floor. "Riders," he said, his voice flat. Clara moved up beside him. She could see them now, a dozen men, maybe more, milling around a cluster of tents. A remuda of horses was picketed nearby. "Who are they?" she whispered. "Mortensen's men," Eli said. There was no doubt in his voice. "They ain't looking for cattle. They're sweeping the valley. They're looking for you, for us." The news had spread, faster than the thaw. A runaway bride and a fugitive killer. It was the kind of story that traveled fast, carried by trappers, by traders, by the wind itself. They were cut off. The way to hard luck was blocked. "We go back," Clara said, her voice small but firm. Eli shook his head. "No, we go west, into the rough country. They won't follow us there." "With a dozen men, they will," she argued, a cold, pragmatic fear rising in her. "They'll track us. You are one man. Your arm is wounded. We cannot outrun them." I can lead them on a chase that'll break their horses." He growled. "But you take my mule. She's the stronger one. You ride south. Keep the sun on your left shoulder. You'll hit the settlement eventually." "No," she said. "Clara, this ain't a discussion," he said, his voice hard, turning on her. "This is what you'll do. They want me. They won't bother with a lone woman, not for long." "You are a fool," she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, cold fury. She nudged her mule closer, her face inches from his. "Do you think they are two separate hunts? They are looking for a runaway bride and a fugitive cowboy. They will find you, and they will kill you. And when they are done, they will find me. And they will drag me back to Thomas Mortensen. And he will make me his property." She let the word hang in the air, the same word that had driven him to kill Silas. "I will not be taken. Eli," she said, her voice dropping to a low, fierce whisper. "And I will not run and let them shoot you in the back. If they kill you, they'll come for me next. My fate is tied to yours now. We both know it." He stared at her, at the absolute terrifying certainty in her eyes. She was right. He had been a fool to think he could separate their fates. By saving her, he had chained her to his. By her staying, she had accepted it. He looked back at the riders in the valley, then at the vast, empty wilderness to the west. Then he looked north, the way they had come, back toward the mountain, back toward the cabin. "One place," he said, his voice grim. "One place I know. One place I can defend." "The cabin," she said. "They'll track us. They'll know where I live. Then we will be there waiting for them," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the frightened girl from the blizzard, but the woman beside him, her face hard with resolve. He nodded. "Once." "Ride hard," he said, and turned his mule north. They rode back with a desperate, pounding urgency. They did not spare the mules, pushing them through the mud and slush, their eyes constantly scanning the ridges behind them. They were not just retreating, they were racing. Racing the news, racing the riders, racing the dawn. They reached the cabin in the deep twilight, the mules blowing, their hides slick with sweat. The little structure, nestled in the pines, looked just as they had left it. It was small, quiet, and felt, for the first time, like a sanctuary. But there was no time for rest. The coming night was not for sleeping. It was for preparation. "Bar the door," Eli said, sliding from his mule. He moved with a stiff, painful grace, his wounded arm held close to his body. "And douse the lamp. We'll use the firelight. No sense painting a target." Clara slammed the heavy wooden bar into place, the sound final and echoing. The small room was plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the orange embers in the hearth. The tension in the cabin was a thick, physical thing. It was the silence of two people who knew that the next sunrise might be their last. Every sound was magnified. The scrape of a boot, the clink of metal on stone, the sharp crackle of the fire. Eli went straight to his cache, a loose box hidden under his cot. He pulled out 2 rifles, his own Winchester, and an older, heavier Sharps. He laid them on the table, along with his revolver and a box of cartridges. "You know how to load one of newfangled things?" he asked, nodding to the Winchester. "My father taught me to shoot," Clara said, her voice quiet. "Though I never shot at a man." "It ain't different," Eli said, his voice flat. "Just harder to miss." He began the slow, methodical process of cleaning and oiling the weapons. His movements were precise, economical. Clara watched him, the firelight catching the white of his scar, the deep concentration in his eyes. This was a man who knew this work. He was the killer the poster claimed he was, but he was her killer. "What can I do?" she asked. He looked up, surprised. He gestured to a small, heavy sack in the corner. "Lead and a mold. We'll need every bullet we have." While he cleaned the rifles, she built up the fire. She found the small iron ladle and the two-piece bullet mold. She began the grim, ancient work of war, melting the lead, pouring the shimmering, liquid silver into the mold, cracking it open to reveal a single, perfect, heavy cone of death. She worked steadily, her hands, which had trembled while bandaging his arm, now sure. She lined the bullets up on the hearth to cool. Each one was a choice. Each one was a word in the argument for their lives. The tension thickened. It was in the air they breathed, in the shared, sharp scent of gun oil and melting lead. They moved around each other in the small space, a grim, silent dance. He went outside, his revolver drawn, and brought in armload after armload of firewood, stacking it high against the wall. "They'll try to burn us out," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But this cabin, the logs are green. It won't catch easy. But the fire, we cannot let it go out." He was cutting firewood not just for warmth, but for light, for a siege. He took one of his axes and began sharpening it on a whetstone. The sound filled the cabin, a high, rhythmic shing, shing, shing that scraped along Clara's nerves. It was the sound of a man preparing for the last, most desperate work. He sharpened the axe, then his skinning knife. Clara finished with the bullets and began to boil water, filling every pot and bucket they had. Water for drinking, water for cleaning wounds. The cabin was a fortress now. The single window was barricaded with the heavy table, leaving only a small slit to shoot through. The rifles were loaded, laid out. The pistols were ready. The axes were sharp. The firewood was stacked. The water was boiled. There was nothing left to do. Eli stood by the barricaded window, peering through the slit into the black, moonless night. The silence outside was absolute. Clara stood by the hearth, the heat of the fire on her face, her back cold. The waiting was the worst part. The preparation had been a distraction. The waiting was a slow, cold dread. "They'll wait for morning," Eli said, his voice quiet, not turning. "They won't risk the high trails in the dark." "So we have the night," she whispered. "We have the night." He turned from the window and looked at her. She stood bathed in the flickering light, her hair a dark tangle, her face smudged with soot from the lead. She looked small and lost and profoundly tired. But she had not broken. She had not cried. She had worked alongside him, her jaw set, her hands steady. He walked to the fire, his bad arm aching, his heart a heavy, cold stone in his chest. He stopped in front of her. "Clara," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. She looked up at him, her eyes wide, reflecting the flames. "I am sorry," he choked out. "I am sorry I brought this on you. I should have never brought you here. I should have let you go." "You did not bring this," she said, her voice trembling. "Finally. The world did. My father, Mortensen. You got in the way." A tear, bright and sudden, slipped down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. He saw the tear, and it broke him. The guilt he had held back, the shame of that kiss, the terror of the coming dawn, it all rose up in him, a wave of desperate, aching tenderness. He raised his good hand, his fingers calloused and stained with gun oil. He hesitated, then gently, so gently, he brushed the tear from her cheek with his thumb. She did not pull back. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, a small, shuddering sigh escaping her. The touch was an inferno. It was the striking of a match in a room full of black powder, the restraint they had both held. The wall he had so carefully rebuilt crumbled to dust. "Eli," she whispered, her voice breaking. He slid his hand to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair. He pulled her to him, not gently, but with a desperate, crushing need. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, the smell of soap and smoke and fear. "I cannot lose you," he muttered against her skin. the words torn from a place so deep inside him he did not know it existed. "I cannot." "Then do not," she whispered, her arms sliding around his waist, clinging to him. "Stay with me, just stay with me, for this night, for what we have." He pulled back, his hands framing her face, his dark, haunted eyes searching hers. He saw no fear of him, only a raw, desperate need that mirrored his own. The world outside was waiting to kill them. The law had already condemned him. Society had already condemned her. They were ghosts, both of them, and this was their last, fleeting moment of life. He kissed her. It was not the hesitant, fumbling kiss by the river. This was a kiss of raw, desperate claiming. It was an apology for the world. It was an ache for what could never be. It was a rebellion against the dawn. His lips were hard, demanding, and she met him with a ferocity that stunned him. It was not perfect. It was not idyllic. It was raw and human and filled with the terrible, aching grief of the condemned. His hands were rough. His beard scraped her skin. Her hands clawed at his shirt, pulling him closer, as if she could crawl inside him, as if she could hide from the morning. He lifted her, his one good arm strong, and carried her the few feet to the bearskin rug before the fire. He laid her down, and for a moment they just looked at each other, their breath ragged. The only sound the crackle of the flames and the pounding of their own blood. He was apologizing with his eyes, telling her he was a killer, a stained man, not decent. She answered by reaching up and touching his scar, her fingers tracing the map of his pain. They came together not in a burst of passion, but in a slow, trembling union. It was a fumbling, desperate attempt to forget who they were, the fugitive and the runaway. It was filled with ache. It was a quiet, desperate apology. "I am sorry," his touch said. "I am here," hers answered. Every touch was a question, and every kiss a prayer. They moved together by the firelight, two broken people trying to make one whole, unbroken moment. A fleeting, tender defiance against the cold and the death that waited outside. After, they lay tangled in the blanket, the fire burning low. The cabin was quiet again, but it was a different silence. Clara cried. She wept softly, her face buried in his chest. It was not a cry of fear or regret. It was a deep, shuddering sob for the sheer, terrible waste of it all. "I wish," she whispered, her voice thick. "I just wish the world was kinder, that we could have just this." Eli held her, his arm wrapped tight around her, his chin resting on her head. He stared into the dying embers, his heart heavy. "It ain't," he said, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Kindness ain't something you're given. Clara, it's what you make, what you take." He kissed her hair. We just took this." They lay in silence, drifting in and out of a shallow, exhausted sleep. They held each other as if the dawn could be held back by the strength of their arms. But the dawn came. It came as a faint, gray sickness at the edge of the window barricade, and then it came as a sound. The distant, unmistakable chink of a horse's shoe on rock. Eli was on his feet in an instant, pulling his pants on. He was no longer the tender man of the night. He was the killer from the wanted poster. His movements were sharp, precise. "They're here," he said. His voice was cold stone. Clara sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest, the blood draining from her face. She heard it now, too, the sound of hooves on the ridge, coming closer. He grabbed his rifle. He grabbed her clothes and tossed them to her. "Get dressed, now!" She scrambled, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. The riders were closer. A man shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the cold morning air. Eli strode to the center of the room and kicked at the bearskin rug. He grabbed a ring bolt and pulled, lifting two of the thick floorboards, revealing a dark, cramped hole beneath. A root cellar, barely big enough for a person to crouch in. Get in, he ordered. Clara stared at him. No, I will fight. You have 2 rifles. I can load. No, he roared, and the force of it made her stop. He grabbed her arm, his grip like steel. You'll be in the way. They'll see you. They'll use you. I cannot fight them and protect you at the same time. He shoved her toward the hole. Get in. It's your only chance. Eli, I will not hide while you die. He grabbed her face, his one good hand forcing her to look at him. His eyes were blazing. You will. You will live. That is the point. You survive. You hear me? He pushed her into the hole. It was cold and smelled of damp earth. Eli, please, she begged, looking up at him. He looked down at her, his face a mask of agony. For 1 second, he was the man who had held her. Then he was the soldier again. He pressed his hunting knife into her hand. If they find you, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, if I fall, do not let them take you back to him. Do not let him put his hands on you. The meaning was terrible and absolute. She clutched the knife. I love you, she whispered, the words she had not said in the night. His face broke. Then live, he said. He slammed the boards back into place, plunging her into darkness. She heard the bearskin rug being dragged over the top. She heard the click of his rifle as he chambered around. She sat in the cold, dark earth, clutching a knife, listening to the man she loved stand alone, facing the door as the sound of a dozen horses surrounded the cabin. In the cold, damp earth. Clara knelt in total darkness. The floorboards above her were a solid ceiling, the bearskin rug muffling the world. She held the hunting knife Eli had given her, the handle slick in her sweating palm. Her own breathing was a roar in her ears, loud as the river. Above her, she heard his boots move, a scrape of wood as he finalized the window barricade, the heavy, metallic click of the rifle, then silence. The silence was worse than the preparation. It was a held breath. She could feel the cold of the cellar floor seeping into her knees. Her world was reduced to the smell of damp soil, the sharp edge of the blade in her hand, and the sound of Eli's boots pacing. Once, twice, then stopping. Hoofbeats! They were no longer distant. They were here. A crunching of mud and melting snow. The jingle of harness. The low, cautious murmur of men. They were circling the cabin. Cain! The voice was sharp, arrogant, and carried a clear, furious edge. It was a voice she knew. Thomas Mortensen. I know you are in there, you murdering coward! I know you have her! Clara squeezed her eyes shut, the knife handle biting into her flesh. Above, she heard nothing from Eli. He was waiting. He was a hunter, and he was in his fortress. Send her out, Cain! Thomas shouted again. Send out my property. Send her out now, and I might let you live. I might. The lie was so thin, so obvious, it was almost laughable. A different voice, rougher, called out, He ain't answering, boss. Fire a warning, Thomas commanded. The world exploded. A shot, deafeningly close, slammed into the cabin wall. Wood splintered. Clara screamed, the sound swallowed by the cellar. Then, the true thunder began. Eli answered the shot. The heavy boom of his rifle from the window slit was followed by a man's high, thin scream. It was cut short. He's at the window, spread out. Gunfire erupted from all sides. It was a hailstorm of lead. Bullets tore through the logs, ripping through the cabin. Clara heard glass breaking, the jars on his shelf. She heard a bullet thump into the table barricade, inches from Eli's head. And she heard Eli's rifle answer. He was not panicked. He was methodical. Boom. A pause. Boom. The cabin filled with the acrid, choking smell of gunpowder, the smoke seeping through the floorboards into her hiding place. She coughed, her eyes watering. Above her, she heard a man yell in pain, a string of curses. Go around. The back. Get the back. There ain't no back door. Boom! Another shot from Eli. A heavy, wet thud, as of a man falling against the outside wall. 2 men. The outline said he kills 2 men. She was counting. The firing became more frantic. The riders were furious now, panicked. They were no longer hunters. They were a mob. They were firing wildly, wasting bullets against the green logs. Then, a different sound. A sharp, cracking sound. "He got Cyrus," a man shouted. "He got him." "He's just one man," Thomas roared, his voice cracking with humiliation. "Rush him! Get to the door!" "You go first, boss." Eli's rifle was silent. Clara held her breath. Was he reloading? Then she heard it. A different sound. Not the deep boom of the rifle, but a sharper, flatter crack. And with it, a low, grunting sound from above her. A sound of pure, sudden pain. It was Eli. A heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards as he fell against the wall. "I hit him!" a man yelled, triumphant. "I hit him! He's down!" "No," Clara whispered in the dark. "No, no, no." The gunfire stopped. The silence that fell was sudden, heavy, and full of menace. "He's hit!" the man yelled again. "He's in the corner!" Clara could hear Eli moving, a scraping, agonizing sound. He was dragging himself. He was not dead. "Kane!" Thomas Mortensen shouted, his voice full of cruel, victorious pride. He was closer now, probably off his horse, near the cabin wall. "It is over. You are a dead man, but I will have what is mine." He stepped into view of the window slit. Clara, in the dark, could not see, but she could hear the change in his voice as he addressed the wounded man inside. "You really thought you could have her?" Thomas sneered. "A filthy, murdering squatter like you? You think you can just take what belongs to me? What belongs to my father?" Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought it would break her ribs. She was trembling, the knife useless in her hand. "She is property. Kane!" Thomas spat, and the word hit Clara harder than a bullet. "She is a debt, owed and paid for. She is mine. And you just soiled her. But I will take her back. I will have my due. And when I am done with her, I will send her back to her father in rags." That was what broke her. It was not the gunfire. It was not the fear of her own death. It was that word, property. It was the image of her father's shame, of Thomas's damp, flat eyes. It was the promise of her future, a cold, daily death. It was the sound of Eli's pained breathing above her. Rage, pure and cold as the river, washed away her terror. She pushed at the floorboards. They did not budge. The bearskin rug was too heavy. "Eli?" she whispered, pushing again, her shoulders straining. "Send her out, Kane!" Thomas demanded. Clara put her feet against the cellar wall, her back against the boards, and pushed with all the strength of her legs. The boards moved. The rug shifted. A sliver of smoky, gray light cut the darkness. She pushed again, scrambling out of the hole, ripping her hands on the rough-cut wood. She rose into a world of smoke and ruin. The cabin was a wreck. The shelves were shattered. The air was thick and gray. And Eli was slumped against the far wall, his rifle on the floor just beyond his reach. His left shoulder was a mass of dark, wet blood. He was alive, his eyes narrowed in pain, watching her with a look of pure, agonized horror. "Clara! No!" he choked out. "Get back! Get back in the hole!" "He's talking to her!" a man yelled from outside. "She's in there!" "Clara!" Thomas Mortensen roared. His face appeared in the window slit, pale and furious. "Come out of there! Now!" Clara did not look at him. She looked at the second rifle, the heavy sharps, still leaning against the wall where Eli had left it. She walked past Eli, picked it up. It was heavier than she had imagined, the barrel long and cold. "Clara, stop!" Eli pleaded, his voice weak, He tried to push himself up with his good arm, but failed. She turned and walked to the barricaded door. She raised her foot and kicked the crossbar. It did not move. She kicked it again, with all her weight. The bar lifted, and the heavy door scraped open a few inches. She stepped into the gray morning light. The world stopped. The remaining riders, there were 7, maybe 8, their horses skittish, stared at her. They were rough men, hired hands, but they were not prepared for this. She stood on the single step, a small, fierce woman in a torn and muddy man's shirt, her hair a wild tangle, her face smudged with soot. In her hands, she held a rifle she could barely lift. Thomas Mortensen, who had been peering in the window, spun around. He stood 20 yards away, a handsome, proud man in a fine coat, his face now a mask of pure, humiliated rage. "So," he sneered, "the bride appears. Look at you, filthy. You look like his woman." "I am not your property," Clara said, her voice low and shaking, but carrying in the cold air. "You are," Thomas insisted, taking a step closer. He was enraged, but he was also proud. He was the boss. He was in control. "You are a contract. You are a debt. You will come with me, now." "I will not return," Clara said. Thomas laughed. It was a high, ugly sound. "And do what? Live here, with him? A wanted killer?" He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her with a cold, assessing gaze that made her skin crawl. "He cannot have you. No one can. Do you know what you are now? You are a fallen woman. You are ruined. No decent man will ever have you. You are worthless." From the doorway behind her, a sound. It was a laugh. It was a low, painful, broken sound, half cough, half laugh. Eli was leaning against the doorframe, his good right arm holding his bloody left, his face pale as death. Blood was soaking the front of his shirt. It had smeared onto Clara's sleeve when she passed him. He looked at Thomas Mortensen, and his eyes, though clouded with pain, were glittering with a wild, defiant light. "Then she's lucky," Eli rasped, his voice tearing. "She's already got one who ain't decent." Thomas's face went white. The mockery, the challenge, the absolute unbroken union in that statement. It pushed him past his limit. He had been humiliated by a runaway bride and a dying killer. "You," he choked, his hand dropping to the revolver holstered on his hip. "You, whore." He was fast, but Clara was ready. She had been holding the rifle, aimed at nothing. Now, she raised it. She did not aim like her father had taught her, not with care. She raised it as an extension of her will. She raised it with the memory of the cold church, the cellar, and the word property. Thomas Mortensen's hand closed on the grip of his gun. Clara pulled the trigger. The Sharp's rifle was a cannon. The recoil was brutal. It slammed into her, knocking her back a step, spinning her half around. The explosion was death-shattering. But the bullet flew true. Thomas Mortensen stood for a second, his hand still on his gun. A look of profound, stupid surprise crossed his face. He looked down. A small, dark hole had appeared in the center of his chest, square on his breastbone. His white shirt was already blooming with a dark, spreading stain. He looked up at Clara. His mouth opened, but only a small, wet sound came out. He fell. He did not stumble. He simply fell, face first, into the mud. Dead silence. The riders stared. They looked at their boss, lying motionless in the dirt. They looked at the small woman on the porch, the huge rifle smoking in her hands. They looked at the bleeding, grinning man in the doorway. This was not what they had signed up for. They were paid to retrieve a bride, to hunt a killer. They were not paid to die for a dead man's pride. One of them, the man who had shot Eli, slowly raised his hands. We're just hired," he said. Another man was already turning his horse. "It's done. He's dead." Let's go." They did not ride, they fled. They wheeled their horses, kicking up mud, and galloped back over the ridge, leaving their 2 dead companions where they had fallen. They left their boss in the mud. The silence that returned was absolute. It was the silence of death. Clara stood, the heavy rifle still in her hands. She was trembling so violently she could barely stand. The rifle slipped from her fingers, thudding onto the wooden porch. Behind her, Eli made a sound, a long, sighing groan. She spun around. He was sliding down the doorframe. The adrenaline that had held him up, the defiance that had made him laugh, was gone. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the porch in a heap.
"Eli!"
She scrambled to him, falling to her knees in the mud and his blood. "Eli, no, no, stay with me!" He was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his face a waxy, bloodless gray. The wound in his shoulder was a dark, pulsing well. She had to get him inside. She grabbed him under his good arm. "Wake up! Help me! Eli!" He was a dead weight, a solid, heavy man. She pulled, her boots slipping in the mud, and managed to drag him half an inch. "No!" she panted, sobbing, desperate. She repositioned herself. She got her shoulder under his chest, put her arms around his waist, and heaved. She did not drag him. She lifted and fell, scraping them both over the threshold, back onto the bearskin rug, back into the smoky, ruined cabin. She slammed the door, dropped the bar. She was safe. They were safe. She ran for the water she had boiled. She ripped strips from her own shirt, from the blankets. Her hands, which had been so steady on the rifle, were now shaking, useless. "Hold on," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Hold on, my love. Hold on." She pressed a cloth to the wound, and he groaned, his head tossing. His skin was already hot. The fever was setting in. She cleaned the wound. It was a terrible, ragged hole, straight through the meat of his shoulder. She packed it, bandaged it, her hands trembling, her tears blurring her vision. She wrapped him in every blanket she could find. He began to shiver, a deep, bone-rattling chill, though his forehead was burning. "Cold," he muttered, his eyes squeezed shut. "So cold." She built up the fire, piling on the wood he had cut. The wood meant for their siege. The cabin grew warm, then hot, but he kept shivering. Hours passed. The gray light in the cabin began to fade. Evening was coming. Eli's eyes opened. They were glassy, unfocused. He looked at her, but he did not see her. "Run," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Clara, you gotta run. The law, they'll come for him." He meant Thomas. "They'll hang you. They'll hang us both. Run." "I am not leaving you," she said, her voice fierce. She bathed his face with a cool cloth. "Please," he begged, his hand fumbling for hers. He'll say you murder like me. You gotta survive." "We will survive," she said, gripping his hand. "Together. I am not running." He drifted away again, into the fever. Clara sat beside him on the floor, holding his hand, the rifle by her side. She watched the fire. She listened to his ragged, shallow breathing. Outside, a new sound began, a soft, whispering shush. She looked at the window. It had begun to snow. Not a blizzard, not a raging storm, just a soft, quiet, gentle fall of white. It landed on the tracks of the riders. It landed on the bodies of the dead. It landed on the roof of the cabin, covering the world, covering their sin, covering the blood. The cycle was beginning again. Cold, isolation, survival. But she was not trapped by fear. She was not the girl who had fallen in the snow. She looked at the man on the cot, the man who was burning with fever, the man who had called himself indecent to defend her. She held his hand, and she knew she was not a prisoner. She was a guardian. They were bound not by the storm, but by the love that had been forged in it. Weeks passed. They did not pass in a gentle flow, but in a slow, agonizing crawl, measured by the shallow breaths of a man lost in fever. The cabin, which had been their fortress, became their hospital. The world outside, covered in a fresh, clean blanket of white, ceased to exist. There was only the small, smoky room, the smell of blood, and the constant, desperate work of keeping death outside the door. Eli's wound was deep. The bullet had torn through muscle, and in the first days, a darkness had crept into the flesh around it. The fever took him, and he did not return. He was a stranger, a heavy, burning body on the cot, his voice a dry rasp in the dark. He did not speak to Clara. He spoke to ghosts. He spoke to Silas Mortensen, his voice thick with a terrible, old anger. I did not ask for it," he would mutter, his good arm flailing, his eyes wide and blind. You put your hands. He spoke to his mother. "It's cold. Ma, the cross. They took the wood. It's so cold." Clara sat by him, wiping his face with a cool cloth, forcing sips of broth and water between his cracked lips. She did not sleep. She dozed in the chair, her hand on his chest, her entire being focused on the faint rise and fall, a living metronome against the howling of the wind. She was terrified. She was more alone than she had ever been, chained to a man who was dying, in a cabin surrounded by the dead. There were moments when she was sure she had lost him. His breathing would grow so shallow it seemed to stop. In those moments, a cold, sharp panic would seize her. She would grip his good shoulder, her voice fierce in the silence. Do not you dare leave me, Eli. You will not leave me here." And he, from some deep, lost place, would groan, his eyelids fluttering. He was still there. The work was brutal. She cleaned the wound twice a day. She ripped up her own shirt, the one he had given her, for fresh bandages. She boiled snow for clean water. She kept the fire blazing, a constant, consuming beast that demanded wood. And this was where the girl from the church truly died, when the firewood stacked inside the door ran low. She stared at the axe. It was his, heavy, balanced, the handle worn smooth by his hands. She picked it up. It felt wrong, impossibly large. She went outside. The world was a blinding, silent white. The bodies, Thomas Mortensen, his men, were just mounds, gentle drifts of snow, their violence erased by the soft, forgiving blanket. She ignored them. She waded through the deep powder to the woodpile. Her first swing was clumsy. The axe head glanced off the frozen pine log, stinging her hands, jarring her shoulders. She remembered watching him, the fury, the rhythm. She set her feet. She raised the axe, put all her fear, all her rage, all her desperate, aching love for the man inside into the blow. The axe bit deep. She worked until her hands were raw, until her back screamed, until sweat was freezing in her hair. She did not chop wood. She fought the mountain. She fought the cold. She fought the death that was trying to claim her cabin. She hauled the split logs inside, her arms burning, and she fed the fire. When the meat ran out, she took his rifle. She had not held it since that morning. She checked the load, her hands, now calloused and raw from the axe, steady on the mechanism. She stepped back into the snow. The silence was different now. It was not a threat. It was a hunting ground. She knew the snares he had taught her to set. She made them, her fingers numb, baiting them with a small piece of salt pork. The first day, she caught nothing. The second day, nothing. Eli was weakening. His fever was a constant fire. On the third day, she abandoned the snares. She took the rifle and she walked. She walked for hours, tracking the small, heartbreaking prints of a rabbit. She found it, a small, gray thing trembling against the white. She raised the rifle. Her father had taught her to shoot at targets. This was a life. "I am sorry," she whispered. She fired. The shot was a small, flat crack in the vast silence. She brought it back, her face grim. She skinned it, her stomach rolling. But her hands did not falter. She made a thin, hot broth. She forced it between Eli's lips. That night, his fever broke. She was dozing in the chair, her head fallen forward, when his voice, thin and real, cut the silence. "Clara?" Her head snapped up. Her heart stopped. He was looking at her. His eyes were clear. The fever light was gone. He was pale, drawn, his beard matted. But it was him. "Eli," she breathed, stumbling to her knees by the cot. She grabbed his good hand, pressing it to her cheek. It was cool, damp. "You are," he whispered. "You are here." "I am here." She wept, the tears she had held back for weeks finally coming. A hot, silent flood. "The others?" "Gone," she said, the lie tasting like ash. "They are gone." He squeezed her hand, a flicker of his old strength. You saved me." "I told you I would," she said, her voice fierce. "Now rest. Just rest." His recovery was slow, a long, uphill climb. The weakness in him was profound. The wound in his shoulder healed, but it healed badly, leaving a puckered, angry scar and a stiffness that would never leave him. He could not lift his left arm above his chest. He was, as he put it, a one-armed man. But as he healed, Clara hardened. She was no longer a visitor in his life. She was the center of it. She hunted, she chopped, she patrolled the ridge, rifle in hand, watching, always watching, for the return of riders. She was lean, her face weathered by the wind, her eyes holding a new, quiet authority. She had faced death, and she had dealt it. The girl who had fled a wedding was gone, replaced by a woman who knew the weight of an axe and the cost of a bullet. As Eli regained his strength, they sat by the fire, the long, quiet evening stretching between them. The intimacy of that last night, the passion and the fear, was still there, but it was banked, like embers, overshadowed by the grim reality of what they had done. "They will come back," Eli said one night, his voice flat. He was testing his bad shoulder, his face tight with pain. "The law, or Mortenson's men. Abel Mortenson will not let this go. His son, his heir." "I know," Clara said. She was patching his shirt, her stitches small and neat. "You killed him, Clara!" He did not say it as an accusation, but as a fact, a heavy stone he was placing between them. "That ain't like me. That ain't self-defense. That's murder, in their eyes." She stopped sewing. She looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "He called me property. He called me worthless. He was going to take me, and he was going to kill you. What was I to do? Let him?" You should have stayed in the cellar," he whispered, the old guilt returning. "I gave you the knife. I meant for you." "I know what you meant." She cut him off, her voice sharp. "You meant for me to kill myself before I let him touch me. That was your answer. That was the mercy of a man." She threw the shirt on the table. "I chose the mercy of a woman. I chose to live, and I chose for you to live." He stared at her, stunned by her fire. "We are in this together, Eli," she said, her voice softening. "There is no your sin and my sin. There is only this cabin. There is only us. What the world calls it. I do not care." "They will hang you," he said, his voice hollow. "Then they will have to find me first," she replied. Spring returned. It came, as it always did in the mountains, not as a gentle greening, but as a violent, muddy birth. The great, deep snows melted, the water running in rivers down the slopes. The creek roared. The world turned from white to brown, and the snow, which had been a shroud, receded. Clara had known this day was coming. She had dreaded it. The mounds outside, which she had learned to ignore, began to reveal themselves. First a boot, then a sleeve. One morning, she went outside and saw him, Thomas Mortensen. He lay not 10 yards from the porch, his fine coat ruined, his face preserved by the ice, a pale, surprised mask. Eli was still weak, unable to do more than walk to the woodpile. This was her task. She took the shovel. She walked to a small clearing, a stand of aspens just up the slope, a place where the sun hit in the afternoon. The ground was soft, thawing. She began to dig. It took her all day. She dug 3 graves, wide, deep. She did not rest. Her hands blistered, broke, and bled. But she did not stop. When the graves were ready, she went to the first body, one of the riders. She took a rope, tied it under his arms, and she dragged him. He was a heavy, limp, terrible thing. She rolled him into the hole and did not look. She did the same for the second man. Then she stood over Thomas, the man who was to be her husband, the man whose last word to her had been a curse. She felt nothing, not hatred, not pity, not remorse. Just a vast, cold emptiness. He was a problem to be solved. He was a weight to be moved. She tied the rope, and she dragged him to his grave. She covered them. She piled the dark, wet earth on top, packing it down. When she was done, she was covered in mud and sweat, her body shaking with an exhaustion so deep it felt like death. She did not say a prayer. She did not mark the graves. She just turned, picked up the shovel, and walked back to the cabin. Eli was waiting by the door. He had watched her, from a distance, all day. He had seen the small, determined figure, dark against the mud, performing the grim, necessary rites of their new life. When she drew close, he saw her face, streaked with dirt, her eyes hollow. He stepped forward, his good arm coming up. He meant to comfort her. She walked past him, straight into the cabin, dropped the shovel, and went to the water basin. She washed her face, scrubbing the dirt from her skin. He stood in the doorway, his heart aching. He had wanted to spare her this. He had wanted to protect her. But she had, once again, proven stronger than he was. "It's done," she said, her back to him. "Clara," he said, his voice thick. She turned, and she smiled. A small, tired, terrible smile. He was heavy, she said. And that was all. The past was in the ground. A week later, the preacher came. They heard the mule first, its bell a strange, civilized sound in their wild world. Eli grabbed his rifle. Clara took the sharps. They stood by the door, a silent, grim pair, waiting. A man on a sway-backed mule emerged from the trees. He was old, thin as a rail, with a long white beard and a battered black hat. He wore the collar. He stopped when he saw them, his eyes pale blue and watery, taking in the 2 figures, the rifles, the raw, defensive posture. He saw the new dug earth on the ridge. "The Lord keep this house," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. He did not look afraid. "Keep riding, old man," Eli said, his rifle steady. "Nothing for you here." "I am Josiah," the preacher said, ignoring the threat. "I am on my way to the mining camp at Hard Luck. The winter was long. Men die without God." He looked at the cabin. "And I am thirsty." Clara lowered her rifle. "Eli, he is just a preacher." Eli hesitated, then slowly lowered his own. "We ain't got much." "A dipper of water is all I ask." Clara brought him water. He drank slowly, his eyes scanning everything. He looked at Eli's bad arm, at the hardness in Clara's face, at the way she stood near Eli, protective. "You've had a hard winter," Josiah said, handing the dipper back. You could say that, Eli said. The preacher's gaze fell on Clara. He stared at her, a look of slow, dawning recognition. I have seen you, he murmured. Clara went still. I have not left this mountain. No, the preacher said. He reached into his saddlebag, his movements slow, and pulled out a worn leather satchel. He fumbled inside and pulled out a piece of paper, folded and damp. He unfolded it. It was a wanted notice. From the town, 2 weeks back, he said. He looked at the paper, then at Clara. It says here, Clara. He read the last name, her father's name, for the murder of Thomas Mortensen. It says, a reward. The silence was a cold, sharp blade. Eli raised his rifle again, his one good hand steady. Old man, he warned. The preacher looked at the rifle. He looked at Eli. He looked at Clara, who had not moved, her face pale but defiant. He looked back at the fresh graves on the hill. He sighed. It was a long, weary sound, the sound of a man who had seen too much of the world. He was a bad man, Josiah said quietly. Thomas Mortensen, and his father, Abel. He is a man who thinks the world belongs to him. He owns the law in that valley. He does not own God. He slowly, deliberately, began to tear the wanted poster into small pieces. He let the wind take them. The Lord, he said, works in ways we do not understand. He brings a blizzard. He fells a sparrow. He provides. He looked at the two of them, at the way Eli's good arm had moved, almost unconsciously, to shield Clara. You two, he said, you live as man and wife? Clara flushed. Eli grunted. What business is it of yours? It is my business, Josiah said, his voice firm. The Lord's business. You live here, in his sight, under one roof. It is not right. It is not decent. Eli laughed, a harsh, dry bark. Decent? Oh man, you have no idea. I have every idea. The preacher said, his pale eyes sharp. I see a man who is wounded, and a woman who tends him. I see a home built against the world. I see a kind of faith. He slid off his mule. Get inside, both of you. What for? Eli asked, suspicious. You are sinners, Josiah said, grabbing his satchel. Living in sin. I will not have it on my conscience. He marched into the cabin. I am going to marry you. They stood, stunned, in the doorway. He's mad, Eli muttered. He's a preacher, Clara whispered, a strange, impossible hope rising in her. They followed him inside. The cabin was dim, smelling of wood smoke and coffee. Josiah stood by the hearth, the firelight catching the silver in his beard. He pulled a small, worn Bible from his bag. There is no time for nonsense, he said, and I have no rings, but God does not need gold. He looked at them. Join your hands. Hesitantly, Eli held out his good right hand. Clara placed her left in his, her hand, calloused and hard, fit against his. The gold band, her father's ring, was gone. She had thrown it into the grave with Thomas Mortensen. Dearly beloved, Josiah began, his voice filling the small room. It was not a wedding. It was a sacrament. He spoke the old words, the words of promise, of sickness and health, and they, the killer and the runaway, the outcasts, the fugitives, they spoke them back. Their voices were low, rough but steady. When it was done, the preacher did not smile. He looked at them, his gaze heavy with the weight of the world he was about to ride back into. What God has joined, he said, let no man put asunder. He closed the Bible. But the world will try. He looked at them, a deep sadness in his eyes. May God forgive what the world won't. He accepted a plate of rabbit stew, ate it in silence, and mounted his mule. He rode south toward hard luck and did not look back. That night, they sat by the fire. They were man and wife. It was a word. It was a piece of paper torn to bits. It was everything. Clara sat on the bearskin rug, her head resting against Eli's good knee. He sat in the chair, his hand resting on her hair, his fingers gently tracing the line of her shoulder. The cabin was quiet. The ghosts were gone. Eli looked into the fire. His face, in the flickering light, was softer than she had ever seen it. The scar was just a shadow. "I ain't ever been worth saving," he whispered, the words so quiet she barely heard them. He was not talking about his body. He was talking about his soul. Clara turned her head, looking up at him. She saw the man who had pulled her from the snow, the man who had faced down wolves, the man who had stood in the doorway, bleeding, and laughed to defend her. She saw the years of loneliness, of guilt, of running. She smiled, a slow, sure smile. "Then I'll be the fool who does it anyway." He looked down at her, and the tightness, the old pain that he had carried for years. Finally, let go. He bent, his one good arm pulling her up, and he kissed her. A long, slow kiss that held no fear, no desperation, only peace. Outside, a sound began, a soft, gentle patter on the roof. Not snow, not a storm. A soft spring rain had begun to fall. They sat together, listening to the sound of it, the sound of the world washing itself clean. They knew the world beyond the valley, beyond the mountain, would never forgive them. Abel Mortensen would hunt them. The law would call them murderers. They would never be safe. Not really. But in that small, rough cabin, with the rain falling on the graves on the hill, they were not safe. They were not forgiven. They were, for the first time, at peace. Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear your thoughts. So please comment where you are listening from to connect with other listeners. Subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your feelings in English.